Hello there. Welcome to our Live at 5 tonight. It is Sew Along with Pam. I'm tangled up in my mask. First of all, I'd like to remind you of our pillow project. This is part of the Sew It Yourself patterns that are available from the Jaftex Fabric Company. And next week we're going to talk about basic piecing techniques to make the pillow front and back. And we're going to talk about some simple quilting you can do on your home sewing machine on your little pillow. And I have one more kit of the fall flavor of the pillow, and I have several kits of the Christmas one. This is the one I'm going to be demonstrating with for our Live at 5 demonstration next week. So that is something you can think about for next week. And the pattern is available as a download from the Jaftex company, and I can put a link to that. I think I put one on our last video. So our last video was actually 2 weeks ago, and we talked about putting borders on, measuring for borders. We talked a little bit about sashing, and something I didn't think about when I was talking last week is if you are doing sashing that has no setting corners. So I've got just a little picture here to talk about. So if you are not using setting corners, I put this on here in color so we could talk about it. The first thing you need to do is measure 2 or 3 of your blocks and make sure that they're all pretty much the same size. Then you want to cut all of your vertical strips. In this case, they're green. You want to cut all the vertical strips the same. So that will straighten up and true up your rows going across. Then you want to make sure that your horizontal strips, in this case they're red, you want to cut all of your horizontal strips the same length so that you make sure they fit together and it makes everything nice and straight. You don't want to start sewing on one side of the block and then just cut off the leftovers, because you can make your blocks with the sashing be as much as a half to an inch off if you do that. So you want to make sure that you don't do that. So I also want to talk about how you cut your sashing so that it's your most efficient way of cutting. So when you are cutting sashing for a project, we'll just pretend we're using this plaid. When you buy fabric off the bolt, it comes wrapped, and you have the selvage on one side and you have the fold on the other side. And the cross grain is going across this way. The lengthwise grain is parallel to the selvage down here. The bias is at a 45-degree angle. That's true bias. Now anything off the straight of the grain, which is length or crossways and lengthwise, anything off of that is considered bias. True bias is 45 degrees. And so that's important to know when you're cutting strips for anything, but specifically for doing your sashing. So one thing to help your sashing be more consistent and stay nice and straight, instead of, if you had a pattern that you wanted to make 2-inch sashing strips, instead of cutting 2 inches across this way, if you cut the width of your block, say it's a 12-inch block, instead of cutting 2 inches this way and then cutting it at 12 inches, if you'll cut 12 inches across the lengthwise grain that's parallel with the selvage, cut your 12-inch strips and then cut 2 inches across this way. Tony says you can't see. Hang on, okay, so again, if you cut your, whatever the width of your block is, 12 inches, you're going to cut parallel to the selvage, your 12-inch, and then cut your 2-inch strips on the lengthwise grain. It's much more stable and it'll keep your blocks straighter. If at all possible, borders that are cut parallel to the selvage are going to be truer and less likely to be stretchy and wonky. So you want to kind of remember that as well. So let me see if I can make this a little bit farther out so I can make sure that I am showing you what I think I'm showing you. Okay, so I also wanted to talk about binding. It is not absolutely necessary to use bias strips for your binding. By that, I mean diagonal strips. Now, if you're using a print like this that's printed on the diagonal, you could cut straight of the grain strips and it'll still look like bias strips just because of the way it's printed on here. So I have a couple of examples of that. Here's a bias stripe. So if you cut strips across the grain, it's still going to look like you've cut bias strips without having to do the cutting of bias. Now, you may have seen in a magazine or on a tutorial how to cut bias strip, or how to prepare bias binding by cutting a square and then cutting it in half and sewing the two triangles back together and then cutting one continuous binding. I find that totally unnecessary and too difficult to mess with. So here's the way I cut bias strips. So this is not printed on the bias. It's printed on the straight of the grain. So I have my selvage here. This is my lengthwise grain, and if you have a piece of fabric that you have right next to the selvage and you give it just a little tug, you're going to find there's very little give to the lengthwise grain parallel to the selvage. You're also going to find, if you give it a little tug on the cross grain, that is from selvage to selvage, you can see the fabric kind of bend as I tug. So it has a little more give. That's one reason why if you do your sashing strips parallel to the selvage, they're going to not have a tendency to be as wonky. So if you can at all use lengthwise grain strips, you want to do that. So I want to use bias strips for this stripe print so that my binding will look like this. So in order to cut my bias strips, I'm going to show you how I do that. This is my fabric, and I just happen to have this stripe in my stash of stuff that I've never used. So I figure the colors are good, but this is how I would approach cutting bias strips. Now, that being said, I don't use bias for binding unless it is something that I want to be able to see a bias or some other reason. If you have anything with curves on it like scallops, then yes, you do have to use bias binding. So if I cut bias strips, I could use my 45-degree angle line on my ruler and cut across here, but you can see my ruler doesn't go all the way across. So this is how I prepare my bias strips. I want to get back as far as I can so you can see what I'm doing. There we go. I think maybe I've got it now. I'm trying to get it where you can see that whole piece of fabric from side to side. So the first thing you do is kind of remember when you made paper airplanes where you folded and you end up with a bias edge on your fold. I folded my selvage to meet the cross grain, and now I could go ahead and cut across here, but again, my ruler won't go all the way across. If I'm using a longer ruler, I could probably get across, but I want to show you how I fold in order to cut bias strips. So you can easily see this is still lengthwise grain because you can see the stripes going parallel to the lengthwise grain. This is cross grain where you go across those stripes. This is bias. So in order to be able to get my ruler all the way across my bias strips, I'm just going to fold it again. And there is lengthwise grain, cross grain, bias. And I have room on my ruler to get all the way across that bias. I can either cut here or I can cut here. Both of those are considered bias strips. Now, if I wanted to, I can also fold that again, just so I have a shorter distance to go and cut my strips that way. You can also fold the other end. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to cut several strips so you can see how that would work. And you just want to line that up as closely as you can on this end. And my first strip, I'm going to cut just a bit more than 2 1/4 inches. And I'll explain that in just a minute. So I'm going to cut, I didn't think that went all the way through, and I'm going to flip this around and then true this up to 2 1/4 inches. That's my choice for my bias strips, or for any size, any kind of strip for binding. I like to cut 2 1/4 inch strips, and that's a personal preference. You may like to cut yours 2, you may like to cut yours 2 1/2. You'll have to determine what works best for you depending on whether you're attaching by hand or attaching by machine, and how you finish it. If you're going to finish it by hand or finish it by machine, that will make a difference of how you want to cut your bias strips. And I just keep working my way across, and I'm already to a point where I can't get all the way across my strip, so I'm just going to fold it again and cut a 2 1/4 inch strip. And I just can keep working all the way across this segment. I'm going to do one more strip and then I'll open it up and show you, because I'm going to end up with a whole series of bias strips. Now I'm going to end up with some pieces like that I'm just going to get rid of. But I can buddy up these bias strips and create whatever length I need for whatever project I'm using. And you want to make sure it'll just automatically end up with all your stripes going the same way. So that's how I would approach cutting my bias strips. I'll get a couple of short ones and show you how I would piece them together, because at this point they would need to be pieced together. So I also, behind me on the wall is that table runner that we made a couple of months ago. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Behind me on the wall is the table runner that's the same pieces of fabric that are in that little sample block I showed you. So this binding is going to go really nicely on that someday, if I don't lose it before I put it on there. But here's how I would approach piecing these segments of binding. So I'm first of all going to piece together some that aren't bias strips, because remember I said unless there's a visual reason, or if I'm doing a curved border, I don't use bias strips. So I have some strips here, and I actually cut this in several pieces just so I could show you how I splice it. So when I sit down to splice binding strips, I'm going to fold across so that I end up with a long tail, and 2 short tails. You want to divide the long side from the short side. If you sew this way, you're going to be getting your seam ripper out, because once you get that sewn, that's what you're going to have. If you sew this way, you're going to trim off the short tails, and that's your binding strip, and you can just keep going and make it as long as you need to for whatever project. Now, when you first start putting together binding, you may be more comfortable in grabbing some sort of a marking tool and a ruler. Well, that's not marking. Let me get one that will. And grabbing a ruler so that you can draw your stitching line across there. And then you're just going to piece across there, sewing right on that line. And before I take that out, then I grab the other end of my strip, however long it is. These are short strips, but you can see. Now notice this is the selvage on this end of the strip. I'm just going to back up where I'm not on top of that selvage so that this part gets trimmed away. And again, I'm going to take my ruler and my pin and draw my stitching line on. You can probably barely see that, but I can see it just fine on that. And You may get to the point where you don't feel it necessary to draw your lines on. If you do this enough, you get pretty comfortable with it. And I overlap just enough so I can know that I am straight, and I'm just eyeballing that to make sure that it's at a perfect angle. But you could also lay the diagonal line on your ruler to make sure that that is going to lay the way you want it to. In order to do that, I would lay it this way and make sure that you are lined up on the horizontal and on the vertical, and then just hold it still till you get your ruler in place so you can draw your line across it. And then you just stitch it. And I just keep doing that till I get the binding strip the length I wanted. I'm going to do one more. And again, I've got the end of my selvage. So I'm just going to make sure I go past that to make sure that I don't end up with any selvage in my binding. You never want to use the selvage in your project because it's not woven the same as the rest of your fabric. And I'm just kind of eyeballing that and making sure it's laying there at the angle that I want. I'm going to stitch right on across that. Once I get that done, I'm going to grab my little fabric tag that I started with and park my needle, and I'll show you how I trim those edges. So I have kind of a little kite tail thing going on here. I've got all of the places where I spliced my binding strips together. So then I'm going to, and you could do this with the rotary cutter. Generally, I just grab my scissors and I eyeball it for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I clipped off the edges so that when I fold it back, it makes a straight strip without any ears sticking out. And then I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to cut where the ladder threads are so that I don't have any of that. Here's where that selvage is, and when I get this trimmed, that selvage is going to be gone, and that's the way that I want it. So I've got several splices in this binding strip like that, and you would just continue doing that till you get all of the connections trimmed. Now, some people would press this open, which you could do. I tend to press to the side. That's just a personal preference. It will create less bulk if you press it open, but that's a personal preference. So I'll talk about what you do with that next in a minute. I want to show you what you would do if you were splicing the stripes. So here's my stripes that I cut. It's going to basically be the same, except notice I'm already at an angle here, and I'm just going to buddy those up together, and I want to make sure that I have a little bit of an ear sticking out on both ends. And if you do that, you can actually move it back. Because of the way I cut it, this is at a 45-degree angle. I can stitch across that, and if you're careful, you can probably do it without marking anything. It may be easier for you and more comfortable for you to start with, let's see, to mark it. So here's another place. There's a little piece of selvage, and I don't want that. And I'm going to stitch this on. So I'm just going to make it over a little bit. And I'm going to grab my ruler. I'll show you how you can mark it if you feel like you need to. Now, depending on what stitch width you use for your binding, that's kind of what determines whether you're going to cut a 2-inch strip, a 2 1/4 inch strip, or a 2 1/2 inch strip. And it may take a couple of projects before you to determine what size is your favorite. I do all machine binding. That means that I do I attach it by machine and I finish it by machine. And for the stitch width that I use 2 1/4 inches works best for me. Some people who like to attach by machine and then finish by hand, like a 2-inch strip of binding, and that is totally a personal preference. Now, notice I did not take the time to match up the stripes. You're never going to notice that when this is all you see. Now, if I was doing show quilting and I thought I might, send something to Paducah, I might take the time to match those stripes. But for most of the time, for the projects that you're going to need, you're never going to notice whether the stripes are matched or not. So if you feel the need, I could always fix that. Let me show you how I would do that. Let me just cut this off here at a 45-degree angle so that I can kind of show you how I would do that. And it's kind of the same idea behind how I did the mitering on the border. Let me get this out of my way so I can get rid of that. All right, so here is my strip, but right there is where I want to match it. Nope, that's not quite the right one. It's more that one. So that's where it would need to match up, and you may have to play with it, and that's not the same one either. You may have to play with it till you find where it actually matches. There's where it matches. And so sometimes it's almost impossible to match it up. There is where I'd have to put it if I wanted those stripes to match. And I'm going to pin it just so you can see. I would find the place it needs to match, and I would glue stick it down like I did last week on mitering borders, but now you can see how those stripes match up. And then after you get it glued down here, then you stitch right in the place where it meets, and then you would have matched binding if that is important to you. Okay, so once you get your binding strips trimmed and pressed, then you're going to press the wrong sides together into a long piece, and I've already done that. And I've got a empty toilet paper holder, or a paper towel holder works really well too, where I have just wound that around it, ready to use for my binding. So this is how I approach binding a project. And I've got those little mug mats that I showed you last week, where I said, if you want to practice this with me, you can make little mug mats. And all I did was take a piece of fabric and do some just real simple stitching here on the mug mat with some fusible fleece in between. So I'm ready to bind this, and I'm going to just leave my binding on my little holder. The first thing you want to do is leave a tail. And I'm going to start kind of, because of the size of this, I'm going to start about 1 inch from a corner, 1.5 inches from a corner. Normally, you would make sure that you left yourself 8 to 10 inches to do the connection. And this is my method of not having to have any special tools to do your binding. So I use my 1/4 inch foot, just the same foot I would use for piecing. And I'm going to, and I do have my walking foot mechanism. It's a kind of an even feed system. I have that engaged, but I have done miles and miles of this with a regular 1/4 inch foot without any walking foot mechanism. So I generally put a pin right here where I can feel with my fingertips that the quilt ends right here at the edge. There's my quilt underneath. And I've got my pin right on the binding, right where it's touching the end of the quilt at the edge here. So I'm going to stitch a little bit. Let me get rid of my fabric tag so you can see. And I'm going to back up. And then I'm going to go forward, and I'm going to stop 1/4 inch from my pin. Now, I have a little notch on my foot, so I know where a 1/4 inch is. If you need to mark that with a pen before you get there, you could do that. Once I get to the 1/4 inch, I back up a couple of stitches, and then I lift my needle. Now, I don't bother to cut that thread. You could, but I just pull it out just a little bit. Let me turn off my light because sometimes it's not as easy to see what I'm doing on my machine. Hang on a second, I got to find the right menu. Nope, hang on. There it is. Machine, light, turn it off. Oh my goodness, that was a whole lot of process to just do one simple little thing. All right, so now I'm ready to turn my corner. So this is what I do. Sitting right at my sewing machine, I'm going to flip this back so that it makes a diagonal fold. And I want to make sure that when I fold this, the edge of my quilt is parallel to the edge of the binding, right along the edge here. And I'm going to just hold on right here and flip this over. And then I'm just going to twist and turn. And when I get that fold, it's right at the edge of my quilt where I folded it. If I peek under here, there's that diagonal fold right under there. And I'm just going to turn and I'm going to start stitching. And I'm stitching right along the edge, and I'm just aligning the edges of the binding with the edge of the quilt. Now, if you feel it necessary to pin this on, you can. I don't, and I don't have any issues with it, but you may, especially when you're first starting. Now, as I'm stitching along this side, and especially if I'm doing a long quilt, a big quilt, when I get to the corner, I'm again going to put a pin right on the edge where the bottom of that pin is touching the edge of my quilt. And I want to stop 1/4 of an inch before I get to the corner. And then I'm going to back up. Just 2 or 3 stitches. I'm going to lift my needle. And again, I'm going to fold this back. And I want to make sure that this is pointing right down to the very corner, and that you can tell when it's in the right place when the edge of the quilt is parallel to the edge of the binding, the raw edge of the binding. And I just hold it in place and flip it over. And then I'm going to turn. So I've got my folded edge here right at the edge of my quilt, and I've got a second fold under there. It's just automatically under there because of the way I folded it at an angle as I went over it. And then I'm going to start stitching. I'm just going to align the edge there. And once I get almost to the corner, I'm going to put my pin in again. This is just so I can easily tell where I need to stop. I'm going to line that up. And then I'm going to back up and lift my needle, and I'm going to fold back where I have that angled fold here, and then I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to align the edges of my binding, the raw edges of my binding, with the edge of my quilt. I'm just going to keep going around my little mug mat. And normally you won't have to keep looking around the camera while you're doing this. It will work just fine. So I'm going to put my pin in. This is my last corner. I'm going to put my pin in where I'm right at the edge of my quilt top. And I'm going to sew where I'm 1/4 inch from the edge, and then I'm going to back up. Lift my needle, and then I'm going to fold this back and flip it over. And this feels awkward when you first start doing it. Once you do it several times, it becomes much easier. So when I'm doing a big quilt, I want to leave myself 8 or 10 inches here to do my closure. So for this little mug mat, I'm not going to be able to go very far across this side. I'm just going to go 1.5 inches or so, and then I'm going to back up and I'm going to cut my thread. So I have gone all the way around. I have a tail on both sides of my little mug mat. And then I've got way more here than I want to mess with. I'm just going to snip off enough that I don't have to mess with all of that. I want to make sure that I have plenty, but the more you have, the more of a problem it can become. So I'm going to just take the two ends, my two tails, and I'm going to make them meet in the middle. All right? And I'm going to take one side, and I'm just going to pull this side out of the way for a second, and I'm going to finger press that side. Then I'm going to bring this one back so that they meet. They're just barely touching. Then I'm going to back up about 1/8 of an inch. Okay, let me get down here where you can see what I did. This side, about halfway between my opening, I finger pressed a crease here. And then on this side, I'm going to make it match. And I'm not pulling and tugging. I just want it to lay there where there's not any pulling or tugging or stress on the fabric. This side, I'm going to leave about 1/8 inch gap. And then I'm going to give that a finger crease too, so that you have just a little bit of a gap in there. That's about 1/8 of an inch in between. And then my choice of widths of my binding is 2 1/4 inches. So that means when I fold it, that makes this 1 1/8 inches wide. So I'm going to use my ruler and I'm going to measure 1 1/8 inch. And let me see if I can find something I can write with that I can actually see, because this is so dark. Maybe I can see this. So I'm marking at 1 1/8 inches. And there you can see that mark. And then I'm going to measure 1 1/8 inch from the other side. I'm going to mark that side. Okay, so you see what I did? I've left 1/8 of an inch in between. I've marked back whatever the width. If you're doing 2 1/2 inches for your binding strips, then you're going to measure back 1 1/4 inches. If you're doing 2-inch strip, you're going to measure back 1 inch. That's just the general rule of thumb. Half of whatever your measured width of your strip is. Now, on that line, I'm going to cut. And I'll show you. I'm just going to cut on that line that I marked so that I have a squared off corner. And this was right on that mark that I did 1 1/8 inch from that crease where I folded it and met it about halfway in between. Then I'm going to do the same thing with this side. I'm going to cut on that line. And now I have my two ends. I'm going to unfold them. So I unfold this top end. Let me back up so you can see what I'm doing. Unfold the top end. And you want to make sure that you check this before you stitch it and trim it. I'm going to unfold the top end. I'm going to unfold the bottom end. And then I'm going to match up the corner. Now with a project this small, you're going to have to kind of wad this up. And it may be helpful to grab something. I've got one of the Wonder Clips just to kind of hold that together so I don't have to fight the fabric of my little quilt top. My quilt top is just a mug mat. And I'm going to match up these two corners. And I'm going to put a pin there just to hold them together. And so then I'm going to manipulate my fabric so that I can line up the top end of this thread tail, and I'm going to put a pin there. And then this corner, I'm going to match up the edges so that I can put those ends together. And I'm going to match those up. So I am going to put a little mark here because I want to aim for that corner right there. Once I get it in place, you can't really see what's under it. So I put a mark there so that you can see where I'm headed for. I'm actually going to stitch across diagonally here. So you may feel it necessary to get your ruler and mark across that. Once you do this several times, you may get to where you don't have to mark it. But there's my line that I'm after. And I'm just going to start stitching. Let me grab my fabric tag and start on that. You're always going to be more efficient with a fabric tag because that way your machine is not as likely to eat the corners of your triangles. And we're just going to go right across that line that I drew. Once I get to the other side, I'm going to grab my fabric tag and park my needle again. And then I'm going to take these pins out. And then we're going to see if what I did is going to work. So once you relax that and give it just a little bit of a tug, it'll lay down across the edge of your quilt. Now, of course, I want to trim this part out. Don't trim that till you check it and make sure it's going to lay down the way you want it to. And so I'm going to grab this. If you don't leave that 1/8 of an inch in between, it may be too much binding. If you take out too much, then it makes this too long, but it works out really well the way this is. I don't have to have any special tools, and I'm ready to stitch across and finish this up. So I'm just going to make sure that my seam allowance under there is just laying the way I want it to, and I just finger pressed it. I don't take the time to go press it at the ironing board. And I'm going to finish up the hole. There, my thread just broke. Hang on a second. Okay, so all I'm doing now is closing up the hole where I joined my binding strips, the tails of my binding strips. And I'm just going to go right across there. Once you get to the end and cross over where you started, I'm just going to give it just a couple of back stitches just to secure it and cut your thread. And I can get rid of these little thread tails. This was what I had that I cut off where I joined it. Now, this join right here, if you could see it close up, and I'm not sure you can because it's there, you can kind of see the seam right there. That seam just looks like a diagonal joining, just like there's one other one right here. That's where I joined pieces of my binding strip. So it looks just the same. They happen to be the same direction. If they weren't, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But there's a diagonal seam. There's the diagonal seam where I joined it at the end. And you can't even see it. So this is how I approach attaching it. You have several options. First of all, you just want to stick your thumb right in the corner. And when you turn that, it automatically makes a little miter right there in the corner. And it'll lay down the way I want it to without any trouble. And I can flip the back, and it makes a nice little miter in the back. You can see just right at the edge of the miter. And some quilters will take this to the iron and press this so that it will lay down nice and flat. I typically don't, but you could if you felt like you needed to, where you just press that binding strip back. I just flip it over, and you may want to use the Wonder Clip. I lost the one I had. Some people like to use Wonder Clips and just go ahead and flip that over and put clips all along. I tend to generally use just a pin. And I pin just maybe 4 or 5 inches to get me started. So I stitch the binding strip down from the front side of the quilt, and I just stitch right in the ditch along here. I can feel with my fingertip if I've caught the back, and it took me several attempts to decide how big my binding strip needed to be in order to be able to stitch in the ditch. And I'll stitch just a little bit so you can see. This is not the color I want to use, so I'm not going to stitch the whole thing, but I'm just stitching right in the ditch, right along the edge of the binding, and I can feel with my fingertip that the back side of my quilt, and I really can't see this with that camera there, but you just stitch right along the ditch, and as I get to the corner, I just flip that corner. If you've got any thread tails that are going to possibly show, that's when you trim them and get them out of the way. And I typically fold back and then flip this down so that I have a nice little miter there. And I'm going to pin it in two places. I'm going to pin it right here, and I'm going to pin it right here. Now I also want to make sure that that gets locked down. So often I'll put another pin here and just capture the corner of that so that I know that that is captured, and I'm going to just go ahead and stitch around the corner. And notice I'm still stitching right in the ditch. When I get to the corner, I'm going to make sure my needle's in the down position, and I'm going to lift my presser foot and pivot. I may just go ahead and use this color. It doesn't look too bad. So I'm going to just pull this around as I go. I typically only pin at the corners, and I can feel with my fingernail that I'm going to make sure that I capture that little edge of the back of the binding in the back. And I'm going to stop so I can show you. And if you decide to stitch down by machine, it may take you several tries to get to where you always hit that edge. And you can see right here where I've caught the edge. Now, if you're doing quilting for show, this is not how you want to attach the binding. You want to stitch it down by hand and do a really nice job. For user quilts, quilts that you're going to use on the bed, baby quilts, charity quilts, this is a quick and easy way to do the binding so that you can be finished. Notice it's a little bit narrower here than it is here for a charity quilt or one just for throwing around on the sofa. That's not going to be a big deal, but if you're going to use it to put in a quilt show, you're going to want to stitch down by hand with a hidden kind of a blind hem stitch. But you can see I've caught the corner the way I want to right there, and there is a little bit of a flap there, but it is not enough to be a problem. So that is how I approach binding without having any special tools. I guess I did have a wonder clip, but you can use pins. So no other specialty tools. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I needed to talk about. Do we have questions about what I did? Okay, I do have a PDF that I'll be posting on or sending on the email with the group that it shows a step-by-step pictorial guide of what I just did in colors that I think you'll be able to see better than you can this brown coffee color fabric. But this makes a quick and easy little mug mat. It makes a quick and a nice gift. Just give them a muffin or a tea bag and their little mug mat, and it makes a nice little gift for someone just to brighten their day. So if you have questions, be sure and contact me. Remember, next week we're going to be talking about the pillow, the patchwork pillow that is the Jaff Tex Sew It Yourself project for this time. So come and see us when you can. We are getting new fabric daily. A lot of times the fabric, Cliff says more like weekly or 2 or 3 times a week. But a lot of times the fabric that we've ordered, the shipping is backed up. So some of the things that we expected to get now, they're going to be backed up a little bit. But we're getting things that we thought we would get in August and September, so it all evens out. So happy sewing. Come see us. If you have questions, be sure and post in the comments or send me an email. And have a great week. And we'll see you next time live at 5.